63 days since Nancy Guthrie mysteriously vanished from her home in her pajamas without the crucial medication that she needs. One source is now sounding the alarm on the investigators' lack of experience, that shortfall possibly having a negative impact in the early but most critical moments of the investigation.
The garage door closed at 11:43 in the evening, and that was the last time anyone saw Nancy Guthrie alive. Not in a hospital. Not at a crosswalk. Not anywhere near danger. She was home. She was safe. And then, without explanation, without a sound, without a single visible trace of what came next, she was gone. The house sat in the Catalina Foothills neighborhood of Tucson, Arizona. A quiet stretch of the city where neighbors tend to know each other's routines, where the streets go still well before midnight, and where nothing about the landscape suggests the kind of events that were about to unfold. It was the kind of neighborhood people move into because they believe in order. Because they believe in predictability. And for Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old and living on her own, this was where she had built her life. She was not a fragile woman in the way people sometimes assume of someone her age. Those who knew her described her as sharp, deliberate, deeply independent. She had a routine. She had her relationships. She had her home, and she maintained it. But she also had a pacemaker. A medical device that kept her heart functioning the way it needed to, and one that her daily life had quietly been organized around for years. That detail would become one of the most critical pieces of information investigators would later examine. The evening of February 1, 2026, had not been unusual. Nancy had spent time at the home of her daughter, Annie, and Annie's husband, Tommaso. There had been dinner. There had been conversation. Nothing about the night had been tense. Nothing visible had been off. And when it was time to go, Tommaso drove her home.
32 days into the search for Nancy Guthrie, investigators are still poring over thousands of tips. But could the missing piece of evidence simply be the suspect's cell phone?
Think of treating your phones, your cameras, your computers as a crime scene.
He walked her to the entrance. The garage door opened, she stepped inside, and the door came down behind her. That was it. That was the moment the visible record ended. There were no signs of distress reported that evening. No argument. No indication that anything was wrong. And yet, in the hours that followed, something happened inside that home that investigators are still working to fully reconstruct. At 1:47 in the morning, the doorbell camera at Nancy's residence went offline. Not because of a power outage. Not because of a technical malfunction that could be traced to any internal system fault. The camera went offline because it was accessed. Someone, through means investigators would later work to trace, reached into that system and shut it down. 41 minutes later, at 2:28 in the morning, Nancy's pacemaker stopped transmitting. 41 minutes. That is the window at the center of this entire case. Everything investigators have built, every piece of evidence, every data point, every theory, all of it connects back to what happened inside that 41-minute gap.
How do you think digital forensics will be able to be used in this Nancy Guthrie case?
Think about the digital traces that we leave behind with every single thing we do every day. Your phone is constantly pinging cell towers. Even if you turn it off, that creates a period of interest. So
when family members attempted to reach Nancy the following morning and received no response, concern turned to alarm quickly. A wellness check was requested. When authorities arrived at the property, the front door was found open. Nancy's medical items, the devices she depended on to manage her health, were still inside the house. Her pajamas suggested she had never prepared to go anywhere. There was no note. No sign of voluntary departure. No indication that she had walked out of that house on her own terms.
Has cell tower data information provided any clues to where the suspect could have been in the neighborhood?
I think the cell data towers have helped us in eliminating people and looking at things and different things, and there's still a lot of that data that needs to be looked at.
Hi viewers, have you ever lived near someone elderly who lived alone, and if so, did you ever worry about their safety? What investigators found when they began piecing together the sequence of events was not what they had initially expected. There was no forced entry. Not a single lock on that property showed evidence of being broken. No window shattered. No door frame splintered. Whoever had access to the inside of that home on the night of February 1st did not need to force their way in. They already had a way in. And that single fact, no forced entry, changed the nature of this investigation from the very first day. Nancy Guthrie had lived her life quietly and well. She had a daughter who loved her. She had a son-in-law who had driven her home that night. She had a neighborhood that looked safe from every angle. And she had a pacemaker that was still sending signals at 1:47 in the morning, right up until the moment someone switched off the camera. Because what came after those 41 minutes is not just a question about one night. Investigators would eventually discover that February 1st may not have been the beginning of this story at all. If this case has gripped you the way it has gripped thousands of people across the country, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. Stories like this one, true, documented, and deeply human, what this channel is built on. Every case matters. Every person matters. And if this story moves you, share it in the comments and tell others. Your voice keeps these stories alive. Because what happened next? What investigators uncovered about the weeks leading up to that night is something no one in that neighborhood ever saw coming. The garage door had barely finished closing before the clock started running. That is the reality investigators kept returning to. Not a slow build-up. Not a gradual escalation. From the moment Tommaso drove away from Nancy Guthrie's home in the Catalina foothills, time began moving in a direction that no one in that neighborhood understood until it was far too late. The sequence of that night, as reconstructed by investigators, was precise. Tommaso had driven Nancy home from his and Annie's residence. He had seen her inside. The garage door came down. He left. That part of the timeline was confirmed. What happened inside that house in the hours that followed is where the record goes quiet, and where the questions begin to stack. Tucson in early February sits in a particular kind of stillness at night. The desert air drops in temperature once the sun is gone, and by 1 o'clock in the morning, the streets in the Catalina foothills are empty. Porch lights hold their positions. Dogs settle. The neighborhood does what quiet neighborhoods do, it rests. Nothing about the exterior of Nancy Guthrie's home on the night of February 1st indicated that anything inside was different. But it was. At 1:47 in the morning, the doorbell camera at the property went offline. Investigators would later confirm that this was not a random failure. The system did not shut down due to a power interruption. There was no weather event, no outage reported in the area, no internal fault logged by the device. The camera went offline because someone reached into the system and turned it off. That act, deliberate, timed, and targeted at that specific device, told investigators something important before they had gathered almost any other piece of evidence. Whoever was responsible for what happened that night knew about the camera. They knew where it was, how it functioned, and how to disable it. That is not the behavior of someone acting without forethought. 41 minutes passed. At 2:28 in the morning, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker stopped transmitting. That detail alone shifted the weight of this investigation considerably. A pacemaker is not a passive device. It monitors, it records, and in many modern configurations, it transmits data remotely. The moment that transmission stopped, a medical record was created, not by a witness, not by a camera, but by the device that had been keeping Nancy alive. Investigators now had a hard endpoint. They had a time. What they did not yet have was everything that happened between 1:47 and 2:28. The front door of the residence was found open when authorities arrived the following morning. Nancy's personal medical items were still inside the house. Her pajamas, still on her, indicated she had not prepared to leave. There were no packed bags. No note. No evidence of a voluntary departure of any kind. The home was not in a state of obvious disorder, but it had been disturbed in ways that investigators documented carefully. And critically, there was no sign of forced entry anywhere on the property. Not at the front door. Not at the rear entrance. Not at any window.
That interview we did with the sheriff this week, we also asked him about the timing of those surveillance images. Despite what some law enforcement sources have said, he maintains that investigators still cannot say definitively if one of those images was taken at an earlier date prior to the abduction. But the sheriff did tell us that he does believe it is the same person in all of those images.
Every point of access to that home was intact. No lock had been compromised. No frame had been forced. This was not the work of someone who stumbled upon an opportunity. This was the work of someone who already knew how to get in. That conclusion, no forced entry, is one that investigators in cases like this do not arrive at lightly. It carries weight because of what it implies. It narrows the field. It points toward access. It points toward prior knowledge of the home, the layout, the locks, the security system, and the woman living inside it. And when paired with the deliberate shutdown of the camera, it presented a profile that investigators began examining from the very first hours after Nancy was reported missing. A reward was announced. Tips began coming in. The case drew attention quickly, and with that attention came the kind of public pressure that shapes the direction of any missing persons investigation. People wanted answers. They wanted a name. They wanted someone to point to. And in the early days, there was one name that kept surfacing, not from investigators, not officially, but from the public conversation that had started building around this case. Tommaso. The son-in-law. The last confirmed person to see Nancy Guthrie alive. His name spread through comment sections and discussion threads with the speed that social media allows. He had driven her home. He had been the last one with her. He had access to her house. The logic felt clean to a lot of people watching from the outside. But investigators do not work on the logic of public perception. They work on evidence. And the evidence, as it continued to come in, was pointing somewhere that nobody had yet fully mapped. Because while the public focused on proximity and relationship, the people building this case were looking at something the cameras had already recorded, not on the night Nancy disappeared, but weeks before it. And what those recordings showed would force everyone involved to reconsider what this case actually was. If you are following this case and you want to know what those earlier recordings revealed, stay with this channel. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss a single update. These are real stories about real people, and they deserve to be told with the attention they require. Share your thoughts in the comments. This community is here for every story, every case, every person whose truth still needs to be heard. His name kept appearing. That was the reality. In the days after Nancy Guthrie was reported missing from her Tucson home, Tommaso, her son-in-law, the man who had dropped her off that night, became the subject of intense public scrutiny. Not because investigators had named him. Not because any charge had been filed. But because the sequence of events placed him at the end of the last confirmed sighting, and in a missing persons case with no immediate answers, that position draws attention. The behavior that observers noted in the days that followed was described in various reports and public accounts as emotionally restrained. Not overcome with visible distress in the way some might expect from a family member. Not publicly vocal. Not leading searches or standing at podiums. His manner, in the eyes of many people watching, did not fit the emotional script they expected from someone whose mother-in-law had simply vanished. Body language, tone of voice, public behavior, none of these are evidence. Investigators understand this. Grief does not follow a single template. Shock presents differently in different people. Some individuals go outward, they speak, they cry publicly, they organize. Others go inward. They become still. They become quiet. The absence of an expected emotional response is not, by itself, proof of anything. But in a case with limited physical evidence and an anxious public demanding answers, it was enough to keep Tommaso at the center of the conversation. Annie, his wife and Nancy's daughter, was also observed in the days following the disappearance. Video footage, referenced in public reporting on the case, appeared to show her leaving the family residence in a way that drew attention. The angle of departure, the apparent avoidance of direct camera coverage. That footage was analyzed, discussed, and debated across platforms by people who had already made up their minds about what had happened.
Even if you're out on the street in front of my house, chances are good that your phone will ping my Wi-Fi. And some people's routers will actually track devices that were potentially connected.
Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos tells us his team has been looking into cell phone data.
Investigators, however, were not working from the same starting point as the public. While names circulated online and pressure mounted from outside the investigation, the people inside it were moving through a different process. They were building a timeline. They were cataloging physical evidence. They were examining what the property itself could tell them about the sequence of events on the night of February 1st. And somewhere in that process, carefully, methodically, they reached a conclusion that stopped a significant portion of the public conversation in its place. The family was cleared. That word, cleared, carries a specific meaning in the context of a formal investigation. It does not mean absolved of social suspicion. It does not mean that investigators simply moved on without looking. It means that the evidence gathered, the timelines examined, and the investigative work conducted pointed away from the family members as responsible parties. It means the data did not support what a large number of people had already decided must be true. For many following the case, this was genuinely difficult to accept. The framework they had built, the proximity, the access, the behavior, the timeline, had felt airtight. And now investigators were saying it pointed somewhere else. The question that followed was immediate and uncomfortable. If not the family, then who? That shift changed the shape of the investigation in a way that is worth understanding. When the obvious suspect is removed from the center, the investigation does not stall, it expands. The focus widens. Investigators stop looking inward at the family circle and start looking outward at the surrounding environment. They start asking different questions. Not who was closest to the victim, but who else had access. Not who had motive within the family, but what other structures, social, geographical, logistical, could have put someone in that house on that night. It also meant going back. Back through the evidence. Back through the footage. Back through the data. Because if the answer was not inside the family, then the clues that pointed to the real answer had to already exist somewhere in the record. They just had not yet been read correctly. And when investigators began that second pass, when they started looking at the weeks before February 1st rather than the night itself, they found something that reframed the entire case. Not a single event. Not one moment. A pattern. A set of behaviors, recorded and time-stamped, that did not look random when placed side by side. Cleared does not mean understood. The case was not solved by removing the family from the center of it. It was simply redirected toward something that had been there all along, waiting to be examined. And when investigators followed that redirect, what they found suggested that the events of February 1st had not begun on February 1st at all. Subscribe to this channel and turn on your notifications. The pattern that investigators uncovered. What it showed, what it implied, and why it pointed investigators in a completely new direction, is exactly what comes next. These stories are real. The people in them are real. Your attention and your comments keep this work going, and every share brings these cases to someone who needs to hear them. The case did not begin on February 1st. That is what the data showed. When investigators moved past the obvious and began looking at the weeks leading up to Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, they found a record that had been sitting in plain sight. Cameras, digital logs, and time-stamped data across the Catalina Foothills neighborhood captured a sequence of events that, when examined in isolation, each looked minor. When placed in order, they told a different story entirely. The first flagged date was January 11th. 3 weeks before Nancy went missing, a masked individual was observed in footage connected to the area around her property. One figure. One appearance. On its own, this could mean almost anything. Tucson has its share of pedestrian traffic even in residential areas, and a single unidentified person on a single date is not automatically cause for investigation. But it was logged. It was catalogued. And it would become relevant. The second flagged date was January 24th. Another unexplained activity recorded in the vicinity. Again, not dramatic on its own. Again, not immediately connected to anything. But now there were 2 dates. 2 appearances. 2 points on a line. And once investigators established that line, they could not ignore where it was pointing. 3 weeks of activity before the disappearance. That is not a coincidence profile. That is a pattern profile. And what that pattern suggested. Carefully, methodically, in the language of investigators who do not use words like guilty without evidence to support them, was that the events of February 1st had been observed in advance. That the property, the neighborhood, the woman living there, had been the subject of prior attention from someone who was working through a sequence. Not acting on impulse. Planning. The concept that investigators began working with is sometimes described in forensic terms as belonging without suspicion. It refers to the ability of an individual to move through a space, a neighborhood, a block, a property perimeter, without drawing attention. To appear present without appearing out of place. In a residential area like the Catalina foothills, this requires a certain kind of access. A reason to be there. A cover that holds up under the casual observation of neighbors and cameras. Investigators noted that near Nancy's property, there was a rental unit. There was also construction activity in the area during the relevant period. Both of these created legitimate reasons for unfamiliar faces and vehicles to be present without raising flags. Someone who understood the neighborhood, who had either studied it or spent time in it, would have known this. Would have understood that the construction activity and rental traffic created a layer of visual noise that made careful, repeated observation far easier to conduct without detection. Then came the digital layer. Cell tower data is one of the tools investigators use to map the movement of devices, and therefore, in many cases, the movement of people, through a geographic area over time. When analysts began pulling that data for the period surrounding Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, they found something that moved the investigation into a new phase entirely. Specific devices appeared in the cell tower records near the property. Not once. Not twice. Repeatedly. The same devices, or devices with consistent identifying patterns, showed up in the data across multiple dates, including the January 11th and January 24th flagged dates. They showed up again in the records from the night of February 1st. And then, in the window immediately surrounding 1:47 and 2:28 in the morning, those devices disappeared from the tower record entirely. That disappearance, the absence of a signal during the exact window when the camera was shut down and the pacemaker stopped transmitting, is the kind of detail that investigators note with great care. A device that goes dark during a specific window, in a specific location, at a specific time, and then reappears afterward is not a random technical event. It is a behavior. And behaviors have sources. The direction those devices moved after that window, the cell tower data that tracked their path away from the Catalina foothills, did not lead back into the residential grid of Tucson. It led out. Away from the neighborhood. Toward terrain that sits at the edge of the city's reach. Desert terrain. Open ground. The kind of geography that Tucson is surrounded by on every side, and the kind that complicates search operations considerably. Search teams, working in alignment with the digital evidence, began covering areas that matched the movement data. The FBI was involved. The investigation was no longer being run as a simple missing persons case. The scope had widened. The structure of the investigation had shifted from reactive to strategic, and the people leading it were now operating with a picture that looked fundamentally different from what anyone had imagined in the first days after Nancy's disappearance. The answer, investigators believed, was already inside the evidence they had collected. It was a matter of connecting each piece correctly, placing each data point in its right position, and following the line to where it ended. That process was ongoing. And it was moving in a direction that the public had not yet been shown. Because the cell tower data did not just show where the devices went. It showed where they had been before. And before the Catalina foothills, before January 11th, before any of the dates that had been publicly discussed, those devices had already built a pattern that stretched back further than anyone investigating this case had initially expected. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications. What comes next, the forensic evidence, the ongoing investigation, and where this case stands today, is the part of this story that pulls everything together. Share this video. Leave your thoughts below. Every comment, every share keeps the pressure on cases like this one and reminds everyone that Nancy Guthrie has not been forgotten. Every answer in this case already exists. It just has not been fully connected yet. That is not speculation. That is the working position of the investigators who have spent months building this case, collecting data, processing physical evidence, and tracking the digital record that runs through the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie like a thread no one can cut. The picture is incomplete, but it is not empty. And what has been assembled is enough to understand the shape of what happened, even if the final confirmation has not yet come. The forensic work in this case has moved on multiple tracks simultaneously. Among the physical evidence collected from the property and surrounding area, investigators recovered DNA samples. Not a single contributor profile, but a mixed sample, meaning genetic material from more than one individual was present. The process of separating those contributions, matching them against known profiles, and working through the laboratory analysis takes time. It is not the kind of work that yields results overnight. But it is the kind of work that, when it concludes, can place a specific individual at a specific location in a way that is very difficult to argue against in a courtroom. Investigators have been careful about what they release publicly. That restraint is intentional. In a case where digital evidence has already shown that someone with prior knowledge of the property and the investigation's direction was involved, controlling the flow of information is itself a strategic decision. What is known publicly is, almost certainly, a fraction of what investigators are working with internally. The movement data, the cell tower records that tracked specific devices away from the Catalina foothills in the hours after Nancy disappeared. Aligned with search activity in terrain to the edge of the Tucson metropolitan area. That alignment between digital records and physical search zones is significant. It means investigators were not conducting wide, unfocused searches across hundreds of square miles of desert. They were working targeted areas. Areas that the data pointed them toward. Areas where, based on the movement profile established through the tower records, there was reason to look. The search has been ongoing. As of the most recent updates available on this case, Nancy Guthrie has not been found. Her family continues to appeal for information. A reward remains in place for any information that leads to locating her or identifying those responsible. The FBI tip line associated with this case has received submissions, and investigators have publicly stated that this investigation remains active and structured, not dormant. What the totality of the evidence suggests. When the pre-incident activity from January, the digital patterns, the 41-minute window, the mixed DNA, and the movement data are placed in sequence, is that this was not a random event. This was not a situation where Nancy Guthrie crossed paths with a stranger by chance. Someone knew where she lived. Someone knew her schedule. Someone knew about her camera and knew how to shut it down. Someone had been in that neighborhood before February 1st, more than once, observing and waiting. The question investigators are now focused on is not whether this was planned. The evidence strongly indicates that it was. The question is who planned it, who had the specific knowledge of that property, that security system, and that woman's life required to execute what the evidence describes. That question is what the ongoing forensic analysis, the DNA processing, and the digital evidence review are all working toward answering. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She was independent. She was trusted by her family. She was living in a neighborhood that looked safe from every angle. And she was failed, not by the people who loved her, not by her community, but by whoever decided that her life and her safety were something they could take away. Her daughter Annie is still searching. Her family is still asking for answers. And the investigators who have spent months building this case are still working. The evidence is there. It has been collected, it has been preserved, and it is being processed with the kind of care that serious cases require. Someone in the public may hold a piece of this puzzle that they do not yet realize is relevant. A vehicle. A face. A conversation. Something seen in that neighborhood in January or early February that did not seem important at the time. If you have any information related to the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the FBI tip line is the place to report it. Anonymous submissions are accepted. Every piece of information that comes in is evaluated. And in cases like this one, the detail that breaks everything open often comes from someone who almost didn't make the call. Between 1:47 and 2:28 in the morning on February 1, 2026, something happened inside a house in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. The camera went dark. The pacemaker went silent. And an 84-year-old woman who had done nothing to deserve what followed simply ceased to be present in the world she had always known. Until that 41-minute window is fully accounted for, this story does not end. Nancy Guthrie has not been forgotten. This case is not closed. And the truth, however long it takes to reach the surface, is coming. If this case has stayed with you, if you believe these stories deserve to be told and heard, subscribe to this channel right now and turn on your notifications. Every week, this channel brings you documented, real cases, stories that matter, people who deserve to be remembered, and truths that should not be buried. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave your thoughts and your questions in the comments below. Your voice is part of this community, and this community does not walk away from stories that are still unfinished.